Boardroom Bound, Episode 131 Leadership Skills from the Eyes of a Four-Star General with Ellen Pawlikowski.
I don't care how much courage you have, courage without competence is foolishness. And that's a big thing in the military. We spend a lot of time training and preparing. If you're going to be able to lead a group of people, then you have to know what you're doing, or have the confidence and know the people that are supporting you or working for you have that competence and know what they're doing.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Ellen Pawlikowski. She is a retired four-star general from the Air Force, only the third woman ever to achieve that rank. She basically ran an organization of tens of billions of dollars and 80,000 people when she was leaving. So we'll think of her as basically a C-level executive, and now has translated that over into a very successful board career, a couple of roles, including at Raytheon. So we're going to hear her story today, not only about that transition, but also as a way on this 4th of July episode to honor our service members and to realize the incredible value that they bring when they move from their second half of their career from working for the government, probably now into working for organizations.
Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about director certification. Want to join your first board, or are you looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach. Now, through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Coaching and Certification course, you get both modern board director candidate packaging and modern board operations knowledge integrated within one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency Designation upon course completion. It's designed for individuals and groups. You can learn more at bit.ly/IBDC-D. That's bit.ly, bit.ly/IBCDC-D. And now let's jump into the show.
Ellen Pawlikowski, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Well, thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it is an honor for me. I have 3 times in the year that I just want to dedicate this show to giving back in a small way that I can to our service members who just give so much to our country. And that's just on their sort of the active duty side, if we can think about it that way. But what I also want to share today is how you're giving back in your post-military career with the skills and experience that you brought, the senior leadership levels that you had, and how you're bringing that into the boardroom today. And I think that's going to translate really well. But I really want to set this up for our audience to begin with, because, when we think about TLAs, the military is full of those 3-letter acronyms. I'm sure most of us civilians wouldn't get that and really understand it fully, but also the fact that you were in one big, if we want to think about a massive corporation of which you ran a very big part of it. So I think we can translate that and understand what it is. But let's just sort of begin by setting up your military career and how you got to the lofty achievement that you did, becoming only the third woman to achieve the rank of general in the U.S. Air Force.
Okay. I started out as an engineering student, as an undergraduate, and I joined Air Force ROTC for a couple reasons. One, more out of curiosity to see what it was all about, and I also was attracted to the opportunity to serve, to be part of something bigger than what I individually would be. And so when I joined ROTC, though, there weren't very many women in the military, and particularly in the Air Force, there was a very small percentage. So when I walked into the ROTC detachment, I found myself most of the time to be the only woman in the room. In fact, I was the first woman to be commissioned out of the ROTC detachment at New Jersey Institute of Technology. And from there, I actually took a little bit of a leave from the Air Force, and I went to graduate school at the University of California at Berkeley and received my PhD in chemical engineering. And it was from there that I entered active duty. And throughout my career, I had just a tremendous opportunity, starting out with smaller efforts, but to be involved in the development of technology for capabilities that enabled our national security to provide the protection that we have in this country. And so I had the opportunity to work on a number of very high-tech programs, bringing brand new, never before designed capabilities to not just the Air Force, but also to the other services. And as I progressed through my career, I was given responsibilities for larger and larger programs and larger organizations, most of the time focusing on what we call the acquisition and sustainment of the systems that our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen use. So I was not technically out there with my rifle or I was not an airplane pilot. As I used to say, I don't fly them, I buy them. But throughout that experience, I learned a lot about leading people, and my last job actually culminated in my being the commander of what's called Air Force Materiel Command, which is responsible for all of the Air Force systems, the development of them, the maintaining of them, and the fielding of them, and the purchasing of them. And so that was my last job, my responsibility. And we spent about $60 billion a year. There were about 80,000 people underneath my command, and many of them were Air Force airmen like me, but a lot of them were Air Force civilians who made a career in the Air Force as civilians, not in the military. All told, it was 36 years, and I went from the rank of second lieutenant to achieving the highest rank possible in the Air Force, which was 4-star general.
And for many of us, if we're trying to imagine what that looks and feels like, I would encourage you to think about the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You might see them sitting around the table with the president, very beautiful uniforms, nicely pressed, lots of medals on their shoulders. Think about what on their chest, but think about the shoulders, the number of stars there. The 4, that's the high, that's where it tops out. Very few of those. So between the people that are currently actively serving and the ones who are retired, that is, I would guess, Ellen, probably less than 100 people that have the 4 stars. That is a very small group of I would say, elite leaders. And when I think about our military leaders, there's so many things that directly translate across to the business world. It doesn't seem a stretch, as many people might think it was. Integrity, leadership, passion, courage under fire, decision-making skills. And I imagine so many boardrooms really could benefit from that. We've seen lots of headlines, unfortunately, of bad situations. We imagine, well, maybe if you have a certain person of a kind of caliber sitting around you, things would be a little bit different. But I would appreciate if you'd help us understand, you spent, as you talked about, 36 years becoming really good and decorated within a structure that has its own language and style. And in moving across to the business world, probably a bit of a culture shock in some ways and a bit of a difference. Help people listening who may not be familiar with the military understand sort of what one looks and feels like in moving from one to the other.
Well, I actually developed a model for leadership when I was in the Air Force, which I used to help to mentor younger leaders and also to frame myself. And I found as I transitioned to the boardroom that model worked very much the same way as it did when I was on active duty. To be a good leader, I think there are 4 key attributes. And my Air Force experience certainly helped me to hone my capabilities in these areas. And I coined it the 4Cs as an easy way to understand it. The first C is courage. And all of us think about this many times when we think about the military as the courage that you see when you see that officer leading his men into combat or in a situation where you're putting people into harm's way, which often happens in the military. But leaders' courage is also the courage to do the right thing even when it's hard. It's the courage to take a stand and to do something that maybe everyone else is not quite sure what they should do or how they should go about it, and your willingness to step up and come forward with a possible solution and to think your way through it. The second C is competence, because I don't care how much courage you have, courage without competence is foolishness. And that's a big thing in the military. We spend a lot of time training and preparing. Many of us hear about in the Navy this program called Top Gun, which the movie was famous about. Well, that was all about training and preparing the pilots for that combat operation. It's the same thing for elsewhere in the military. If you're going to be able to lead a group of people, then you have to know what you're doing, or have the confidence and know the people that are supporting you or working for you have that competence and know what they're doing. Same thing in the boardroom, as you're sitting around the boardroom, and that's what the so important value of diversity in the boardroom is, having those two attributes. And then the third one is commitment. People will follow you anywhere if they believe that you trust them, if they believe that you are going to be there with them, that they're not going to abandon you. And there's some really good examples of seeing how many great CEOs, by the way, through this pandemic, demonstrated that, as well as board members. And then finally, in my mind, one of the most important ones is compassion. It is understanding that the people that you are leading, that they have lives, they have parts of them, their families, and all these things are important to them, and their success as an individual is as important to you as it is to them. And I found that each one of these attributes very much applied in the boardroom as it did when I was in active duty. One of the key things in the boardroom, to give you an example, is to ask the right questions, to make sure that management, which you're there making sure, representing the shareholders, to make sure that management is making the right decisions and guiding the company. Well, the best way to do that is to be able to ask good and challenging questions. And now, if you think about those 4Cs, part of it is not being afraid to ask the tough questions, to maybe go against what seems to be the trend in the room, and to really challenge and make sure that has been thought out. The second is the competence piece. You can't ask good questions if you don't take the time to be prepared for a board meeting. And that is clearly one of the things that I focus very much on, is making sure that, I've done my homework, I understand what the issues are, and as a person that did not have a lot of corporate finance experience, I found that it really paid off for me to take the time to read and to learn, and to learn from my fellow board members those things that I didn't know. And of course, the commitment piece, knowing that you're going to stand by the CEO when they make a tough decision. I think just is so much more effective for board members when they take the approach that, yes, you're there to ensure that the CEO is doing the right things, but it's a teamwork. It's not you as an individual, and you need to be able to stand by and support much the same way I had to do as a commander. And then finally, that compassion, understanding the people, not just the leadership, but the entire workforce within the corporation. And there, when I think about some of the efforts, for example, that on the Raytheon board, where we saw the board actually go through and approve measures in terms of compensation and in terms of approval for special programs to help the employees get through some of the challenges associated with the pandemic. So all of those things I learned and honed as that model as a military officer were just as important as a board member, and I think has made me a much more effective board member because of that experience I had in the military.
So I love that model, Ellen. And let me ask you about this, because I also imagine sort of the chain of command structure in the military. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how it translates across to the civilian world. So I could imagine you might be briefing the president, right? And so you, of course, are asking questions in a respectful way. Still fits within your framework. You have to be prepared. They have to be really good questions, but it's, ultimately the president might have been telling the chief of staff, we're going to pull out of Afghanistan by this date. And the chief of staff's probably saying, okay, is that Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, is that a decision, sir, right? You have to ask the questions in a way. And I imagine some boardrooms, not as civilized perhaps, right? But still figuring out how to ask the questions in a way that are probing of people, that are kind, that allow them to deeply think without painting them into a corner. So we haven't really covered that, but I imagine that is a really good skill set that many more people in the civilian world would benefit from. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, one of the things that you're required to do when you are confirmed as a senior officer, which is a 3-star general or a 4-star general, is that you make a commitment to the Congress, specifically to the Senate, that you will provide your best military judgment regardless of whatever the particular stance is of the civilian leadership. It's something that is considered very important. And I think your discussion about decision making, I thought about that commitment, and when you make that commitment, that's part of that integrity question you talked about. And so but you also recognize that you are sometimes thrown into, as a military officer, even though you make that commitment, you're often put into difficult situations where potentially you do need to be able to navigate where the position that the commander-in-chief has taken has risks associated with it. And you need to be able to relay those risks to the decision makers, such as those in the Congress, but in a way that is not attacking the person who made the decision or the quality of the decision. And I think much the same way when you're engaged with the CEO or one of the presidents, one of the officers, and they come forward with a set of recommendations, that viewing it that same way is how I do it. Okay, this is the decision you've made. Have you thought about the risks that are associated with this? Do you understand? What are you going to do if that doesn't materialize the way you think it was and this happens? And I find that same tool that I would think my way through when you are dealing with a challenging decision that potentially was politically charged, so that you can do that commitment piece, but also make sure that all the stakeholders involved have an understanding of the risks associated with the direction that the management is choosing to go.
So, Ellen, I love that a lot. I think that's a great example that we can all follow. And I imagine that's just a piece of it. So if we say that's a sort of the flag officers, the senior military types, probably generally have that great experience, the expectations, the 4Cs you're talking about. But a piece of it I also want to translate across for our audience is you also had a personal brand. You have a great skill set, your background experience. Think about the advanced education that you have, sort of logistics, research and development, pieces like that organizations could easily say, oh my gosh, we need Ellen's expertise in this. Combined with a sense of like how the whole world is structured together and great decision making. So I imagine leading the materiel command gave you that sort of upper echelon view and perspective that translates across to the organizations, like a Raytheon, that they can see this is exactly what we need. But of course, there's a bit of a translation from your first career to your second career being on a board. Can you tell us what that was like, about how you perhaps marketed yourself, and then perhaps, I imagine there were choices about which boards to join?
Well, I think that definitely being involved with a company that does business with the federal government is a much easier transition than going into a pure commercial company. And much of what I learned in my job, I like to say one of the values that I bring to for example, the Raytheon board, is that I have sat on the other side of the negotiating table. I've been there negotiating that and discussing that multi-billion-dollar contract and how much it's going to cost and how long is it going to take. And so I can provide insight as we work through issues about what the thought process is, because the thought process is between the government and even the defense industry are not always completely aligned. Both sides are aligned with trying to deliver capability for our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen, and of course our allies when it comes to foreign military sales. However, there is an interest on the part of the defense industry to ensure that they're providing value to their shareholders. And that means that even though our overall motivation is the same, that in some ways there are things that are different. And the value that I come to the board is when we're trying to understand, well, why is the government asking for that? Or what should we think about when we prepare to propose this approach to the government? To provide insight to say, well, you know what, that's important to your shareholders, but it's not important to the government. This is what is important to them, and therefore, and they are your customer, right? That's the piece that I bring, is especially having been in if you will, a buyer. I can help them to understand what's important and what's not important. And I'll tell you the other thing that I find that has value is, and that is my role on audit committees, particularly those that are associated with the defense industry. Is I, of course, had very little background in corporate finance and things like compliance with Sarbanes-Oxley and all of those things when I joined the board. I had to learn about it. However, the same thought processes, the same rationale for compliance is there for military systems. It's just a little bit, it's a different set of rules, but the philosophy, the mindset, that is the same. And so I found that I was challenged initially at, shall we say, calibrating what was important to my stakeholder, which was the shareholder, in perhaps a way that I had never thought about as the person on the other side of the negotiating table. So that was a huge learning experience for me to get to understand those aspects of corporate finance and what motivated our shareholders and what they were looking for from the company. That part was a climb for me. I had to work hard and learned a lot from my fellow board members, which is a highlight of the value of diversity. And between the two groups, those on the board that had the national security experience and the members that came largely from the corporate world, I think we're able to much more effectively provide the right balance and understanding of what's important and what's not important, and help management to to make informed decisions.
Ellen, I love that. I'd like to pick up on a nugget of something you said there and draw this out because I think this is interesting. We've never talked about it in the show before, but I know something that you were telling me before that you wish you'd known before the board journey started is understanding the importance of different kinds of investors and the approach that they take. And that should influence perhaps some of the boards that you join because they're your bosses. And we can think about some of the biggest investors in the world, the BlackRocks, the Vanguards, the State Streets, who if they call up the CEO or the chairman of the board and said, we have some opinions we'd like to give you, you'd say, great. Do you want to meet tomorrow or the day after that, right? They're that important now. So can you elaborate on this a little bit?
Well, yes, I think this is one of the things that I learned from being involved in companies, as I mentioned, that do business with the government, and those are and the defense industry in particular, and those that are largely focused commercial. On the kinds of people who invest, the kinds of companies or individuals that invest in a defense company that does business with the government are often different than those that invest in a company that's largely in the commercial side. And a specific example is a commercial company may be very much focused, or you can have a set of shareholders that are very much focused on the increasing margin. Revenue is important, but they really want to see high profit margin. They're not worried. They're looking at growth in the stock. They're not looking at a steady dividend. They're really looking at how fast can that stock price go up? How can I increase my free cash flow as fast as possible? Well, in the defense business tends to attract investors that are looking more for stability. They're looking for a dividend type of company, one that they have a reasonable assurance of long-term growth, one that is reliably delivering a good dividend, and there isn't as much focus on the profit margin. It's more focused on generating the revenue, and you see, let's just say, more modest margins. And if you end up with a company as a that is focused more on that short-term thing, and that's not something that you're familiar with and comfortable with, it can cause you to not be as prepared to support your shareholders in the same way as it would be if you are with a company that is more focused on that longer-term growth with longer-term stability in terms of the dividends.
I think that's very helpful advice for all of us to think about because we're often on the show thinking about we don't want to take the first board opportunity we have. We want to take the right opportunity because we will excel and do well. And I think what you've laid out there as a framework is useful for all of us to think about what a right spot for us would be. And I wonder if we can use that to sort of go back in time, Ellen, as you are beginning your transition away from the military, looking into the board space. How were you going about marketing yourself? And I imagine part of it might be sort of the skill set, the expertise that you bring, but also some of the military aspects to it.
Yeah. Well, actually, to be honest with you, Alexandra, I didn't market myself. I often have folks tell me, "Hey, how do you get on boards?" I was contacted by search firms before I even had thought about being a board member. I had heard a little bit about it from my other friends, but so what I did, though, was because I really wanted to make sure I understood what boards were all about, I got involved in the NACD. I took their Battlefield to Boardroom class, which was an excellent overview of what boards were about. And that helped me to understand better what it meant to be a board member, and also to help me to recognize where I needed to do some more homework and needed to get smarter on things as a result. So for me, it was more making sure that I understood what was going to be expected of me and took the time to learn about it than actually trying to market myself. I only have to assume that there are search firms out there, particularly those that do work with the aerospace and defense industry, that are basically out there tracking retiring general officers and approach them if they think they're a good candidate. And I think the things that made me a good candidate, one was that, as you say, that CEO level experience, leading a large organization. There's not too many industry firms that have 80,000 people and spend $60 billion a year.
Right.
So that definitely was, I'm sure, something that caught the attention of the search firms that were going out there. But for me, it wasn't a matter of, I put a resume together as part of the process. I almost thought it was because they needed to kind of fill their record, to complete their record more than anything else.
So, Ellen, it's really helpful as I think about how to encapsulate this episode. You've had almost two halves of your career, if I can call it that, right? A long and distinguished in the military, and now as you embark on your civilian life, doing some work in academia, but also some great board work. I wonder if you have a personal career objective as a professional board member.
Well, I want to be a good board member. I would like to eventually maybe have the opportunity to be the chairman. Now, on some of the bigger boards, obviously, it's typically just it's the CEO who is the chairman. But there are smaller boards where there would be an opportunity for me to chair the board. So that's kind of where I'm trying to build up my experience to be able to do that, because that is a particularly challenging job as a board member, to be that chairman, to be the one that is essentially working directly, almost on a daily basis, with the CEO and ensuring that things are running smoothly. And so that's kind of my objective. That's like achieving being a 4-star, as far as I'm concerned, is to be able to be a chairman of the board.
Well, I imagine it's also a lot of fun, sort of the growth and development that comes being in this sort of new opportunity and new space for you. And Ellen, it's been instrumental for all of us listening today, both to appreciate the background and experience, the credibility, the skill set that the senior military officers bring to the boardroom, and knowing that this is our 4th of July episode, and this is meant to honor our veterans and our service members. I would love to give you the last couple of minutes of thoughts around this space that we should all take away from it.
About the 4th of July?
Well, in terms of this is the background, this is the space, this is an episode that we can use to honor our service members. I think in terms of holding it up for other people to realize that these are quality people that they should be thinking about for the private sector after someone leaves the military.
Yeah, I think, the military is a great opportunity to find people that have all the attributes that are needed to be a good board member. They are people that care a lot about what they do. They care about the people that they're working with, and they have tremendous experience in terms of being given responsibility to make, in many cases, life and death decisions. And that experience is just a tremendous learning platform for people that are then trying to go out and continue to serve as being a board member and continuing that service focus. So I I think the experience that you get just from the pure opportunity to lead, the opportunity to understand risks and how to go about mitigating those risks are just the best thing that that we can bring to the board. And I think I don't know anybody who has been disappointed about bringing a military retiree onto their board.
Well, Ellen, we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and making a great case for exactly what you said, why organizations should be looking to bring these people onto the boards, and thereby helping all of us to be boardroom bound. That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Ellen Pawlikowski. This is someone who has been at the highest echelons of the military, and it was really easy to hear in the episode the incredible background and skill set and experience that she is bringing to organizations that she is working with today. And it's a great example for all of us to realize the men and women who have served and are still serving this country now, and what a value they would bring to the organizations that we are working with. Now remember to head over to podcast.gordon.edu so you can find the links to all of today's resources. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.